Now, for tonight's speaker, we have Dr. Michael Wall, who has served as the curator of entomology at the Nat for the past 15 years. And like many museum professionals, he wears many hats, and since 2008, he has also served as Vice President of Science and Conservation. He's passionate about collections-based research and regional exploration. Michael got his bachelor's and master's degrees in botany at Auburn University before converting to the dark side of entomology for his PhD at the University of Connecticut. While working on his PhD, he received a Fulbright fellowship to study at the Australian Museum in Sydney, where he returned for a postdoc prior to coming to San Diego. So, welcome to Michael.
Thank you, Justin. Greetings, everybody, and hopefully if you're joining us tonight, you know why you're joining us tonight. But if by chance the state of biodiversity is new to you, here's your crash course. 4 years ago, the Nat started holding a yearly symposium centered around the state of biodiversity and ecosystem health. And we call it, appropriately, the state of biodiversity. Why? Because there's a lot of things that are going on in the world that divide our attention, right? And some of those are really tangible and proximate, and they're just, quite frankly, easier to wrap our heads around, like washing our hands and things like that. Others, like climate change and biodiversity collapse, can feel really abstract and distant, yet their impact promises to be very large. But what I don't like about this cartoon that you see before you right here is that those waves seem inevitable, right? Like that, we can't stop them. They're predetermined futures that are going to crash down upon us. But at the Nat, we don't think that's the case. There are reasons for hope, and it begins with education and bringing people together to use science and creativity to sculpt a socially just future where healthy ecosystems that support human health and well-being can come together, and thus the state of biodiversity. Now, February 2020, let's rocket back to the past, to our third annual State of Biodiversity. And those were the good old days, right? Not a mask in sight. People sitting side by side. It was a different time, right? And at the time, there were 43,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 with just a notch over 1,000 deaths. I remember when I gave this presentation, the summary a year ago, the total number of confirmed cases in the United States was only 13. Smash cut to today, and it's a much different picture. We've lived through a hell of a year, and there's no doubt about that. And that meant that the state of biodiversity had to be different, right? We had to adapt to this, and I think we adapted pretty well. And I hope that those of you who are with us who joined us for any of the sessions enjoyed it. And it certainly was a pleasure to work with the speakers and researchers who joined us to bring it to the, I think, close to 400 different unique attendees that registered for the event. Now, in addition to COVID-19, right, 2020 had lots of other things that might get one down. There were the Australian bushfires. We had bushfires in our own backyard. We had a record-shattering 2020 hurricane season. We had a national election that was sort of marked by chaos. And then we also had this long overdue awakening to many folks in the US of how the unjust reality that is lived every day by many others. And so perhaps it isn't surprising that a lot of folks are on edge right now, depressed or just in a funk. I won't lie to you, I've felt all those emotions. And you're like, dude, man, thanks a lot. Didn't you just say there's reasons for hope, Michael? Your inspiring talk is just really not helping. And you're right. I understand. I've just bummed you out at some level. But believe it or not, I'm here to implore you that you shouldn't lose hope. There are reasons for optimism, and there are reasons to keep fighting for a future that the world deserves. And it was really with that mission in mind that the State of Biodiversity Advisory Board brainstormed and got together to put together the slate of subjects and speakers for this year's State of Biodiversity Symposium. And we thought, hell, if we want to exude a message of hope and optimism, then why not start off with one of the founders of Earth Optimism movement, and that's Dr. Nancy Knowlton, who was our keynote speaker. Now, Nancy and her husband are reformed pessimists. They were once referred to as Doctors Doom and Gloom, and that's because they were seeing the world fall apart, the world that they knew, the marine biology world, marine ecosystems world. But through time, they changed their tune, because in addition to seeing things fall apart, they were seeing resilience within ecosystems recovering, and conservation successes. And really, the conservation psychology research is pretty clear, right? You tell people that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and some unfavorably large percentage of those people are going to zone out with a sense of helplessness. And that's not going to help solve the problems of the world. And so ultimately, Dr. Knowlton and colleagues launched this idea of ocean optimism, hashtag ocean optimism. And to talk about stories of success in ecosystem recovery. And then, well, why not broaden the scope? Because there's more to be optimistic about than just the ocean. And this started the beginning of the movement of Earth Optimism, and which the Smithsonian had a summit back in 2017. And I really encourage you to go back and watch Dr. Knowlton's presentation on YouTube, and because she talks about lots of examples of things that I think will bring you hope. They certainly brought me hope in listening to her presentation. But just for a few examples, right? We don't need to look any further than our backyard to the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance's Condor program, California Condor program. This is a critter, just to remind you, that was relegated to just 27 individuals only in captivity in zoos, but now numbers over 500 and is distributed across much of its native range. So a true case of something coming back from the brink of extinction and steadily improving on a yearly basis. And here's a theme that I'm going to be returning to repeatedly. In fact, I would say this is the central theme of my talk tonight, is that true conservation success can't be achieved without the buy-in and knowledge of the people that depend on those lands. And the shining star of this philosophy is Cabo Pulmo in Baja California Sur. And I could spend an hour talking about this, but I shouldn't do that, because really what we should do is have Dr. Octavio Aburto talk about his research and findings down here in the area. But what the story goes is that they have found that that these community managed ecosystems, this was driven by the community, are much more viable and sustainable than the status quo coastal development and fisheries within the Gulf of California. And it's a true case of this, the local communities driving the conservation that helps sustain their economy while also creating resilient ecosystems for biodiversity. So let's don our Earth Optimism caps here and bravely stare into the face of some of those headlines that we've seen throughout the course of 2020 and ask, how can science and creativity turn a world that it's pretty easy to be pessimistic about into a future in which we can be optimistic about? So we're going to start with binational biodiversity in the border, one of our symposium sessions for the State of Biodiversity. And, you know, if we stare bravely into those headlines, we see headlines in which there's human tragedy and health concerns. And whether you support a border wall or not, there's no denying that it is creating an issue. It's creating a scar across national parks, and it's creating an issue for biodiversity. Might not be your priority, but it's creating an issue. So we see these headlines. We understand that there's something going on down at the border. How does this relate to biodiversity? I mean, isn't there enough biodiversity that's not around the border? Isn't there plenty of places for biodiversity to hang around in, that so that the border can just be its thing, the border? And those are the sorts of questions that Dr. Daniel Thornton from Washington State University talked to us about. But we can see the answers in our own backyard, right? Mountain lions and bighorn sheep cross the border all the time, and they don't need a passport. Okay, and so wildlife is moving across borders. But let's take a look at some of Daniel's research and explore that a little bit more. 62% of mammals in the Americas have transboundary ranges, but their conservation status can vary across those borders. So here we see along the coast of Ecuador down to Chile. This is the Smoky Bats range, and it's endangered up here in Ecuador, but not listed down in Chile. Same goes for the black howler monkey, whose distribution that you see here. Down in Argentina, it's listed. In Brazil, it's not listed. And I could give you examples of this in our very own border region of butterflies, of plants, of birds, and mammals that have differing statuses on each side of the US-Mexican border. And so biodiversity doesn't recognize that, right? And so in order to successfully manage these species that have transboundary ranges, we have to think about the border and the socio sort of political situation in which these poor critters had the ill opportunity of having their range be within. And Dan brought up this study that came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at this on a global basis. I'm just highlighting the Americas here in this slide. But 30% of mammals and birds have the majority of will have the majority of their climatic niche in a new country under climate change models. So what this means is with climate change, things are going to have to move around, right? Because where they live right now, the conditions are going to change and they're going to need to move around. And the majority of 30% of mammals and birds is going to go somewhere else. It's going to go into a different country in which they may not have any status, right? And so we can see between Colombia and Brazil, right, there's a lot of species that are going to be impacted. But we are not alone, or they are not alone, because our very own border in our backyard is another hot spot for border biological diversity and border issues. Now, what if we overlay all the political borders in the Americas that have barriers complete or under construction across them? Well, we got an area we should focus on, and it just happens to be in our backyard. So there's a lot of critters that are going to be impacted by a closing off of migration routes and et cetera through across this border. And so it's complicated. And in order to deal with these complications, right, we have to think binationally. Now, fortunately, there are a bunch of young, innovative thinkers that are out there in the world thinking binationally. And at State of Biodiversity, Dr. Lorena Villanueva talked about her research looking into the morphology and genetics of palms, which are these not just any palms, these iconic palms that we see lining the streets of LA that mean what it means to be in Southern California. And these researchers, like Lorena, they're looking beyond the biology and ecology of these critters and plants and looking into the socio-political situation in which conservation is dependent. And enter Dr. Arturo Ramirez Valdez, excuse me, who talked about his doctoral research on the giant sea bass. And so here we see this map of the distribution of the giant sea bass, and you can see, oh, okay, it's mostly in Southern California, a little bit up here, but the vast majority of it, at least according to all of these records, are down in the peninsula of Baja California. But let's look at the state of scientific research centered around the giant sea bass, and you can see, oh, it's all taking place at sites in California, the Alta California, with very little research where the majority of its range is. Now, we're going to come back to that. I think you can already see that there's an issue at hand here, right? If we go back and look at the historical catch of the giant sea bass, excuse me, in U.S. waters, it collapsed in the 1930s. And it was this collapse and that really sort of drove conservation thinking around the status of the giant sea bass. And really where we are today is that if you go to the IUCN Red List of critically and endangered species, or critically endangered species, giant sea bass is listed as critically endangered. And that is based off of what we know based on research that's done in the US waters. But we know, right, we just showed you that image, that there's research that hasn't taken place in the majority within its range. And so Arturo's work is highlighting this and showing that if we look at the fishery catch within Mexican waters, there really isn't evidence of a collapse of the fishery in Mexican waters. And so while research has taken place primarily north of the border, the population, the fishery production, the fishery sales is primarily south of the border. And so we have these asymmetries, right, in scientific research and management across this border. Exactly, right? Back to what Daniel Thornton was talking about. In Mexico, it's this way. In the US, it's that way. And there the twain should meet. Well, of course they meet, right? They don't stop at the border. There's no passports being collected in Tijuana out in the ocean. And so Arturo had some recommendations that I really want to spend a second talking about, because they're going to come up over and over again throughout this, not just the binational border section, but throughout this summary that I'm giving. And this bullet point number one is critical. Building capacity across the border. And this is across the border, but you can substitute anything into there. You can say building capacity with people most likely to be impacted by the conservation measures, and develop programs that provide training, professional development, field experience to graduate students, scholars, and the local people. I would add that onto these final recommendations. And then there's some more specific ones centered around the marine ecosystem that Arturo brings up. They're relevant as well and could be translatable to any sort of transboundary management program or issue that we need to be thinking about, not in the range of political borders, but within the range of the ecoregion and the critters that occupy this space that don't have passports. All right. And this is what the Sky Island Alliance is doing. And the Sky Islands Alliance, Louise Mistel, is the executive director of the Sky Island Alliance. She was very kind to give us her time to come and be part of the State of Biodiversity to talk about their work. Now, if you're not familiar with the Sky Island Alliance, it's a group that focuses on 55 different Sky Island mountain ranges between the US, mostly Arizona and New Mexico, and Mexico itself. So it's this region of where a bunch of ecosystems are coming together in really interesting ways with a lot of biological diversity. And yeah, they're interested in charismatic transboundary species like the jaguar, but they're also interested in the over 4,000 plants that call that region home, and the litany of vertebrates, including 114, species of mammals that are in that region. And how are they sort of dealing with all this? Well, they do it through collaboration, science, outreach, more collaboration, implementation, and then even more collaboration. As you can see here through the list of organizations that are involved in these initiatives that they're working on. And these are not just governmental organizations and agencies and conservation groups, but they also represent tribal nations within both the US and Mexico, and Mexican agencies as well. And so they're really bringing, like I said, the people closest to the conservation impact into the conservation, because that's the only way that it's going to be successful. And so what's their goal? Well, they want to improve connectivity by not just looking at the now, but looking at the climate-driven range shifts, right? Going back to Dan Thornton's research on climate change range shifts. Those things got across the border one way or another. They're taking this into consideration. Simultaneously, looking at human quality of life things like watershed recharge and fire, and the things that local people are depending upon in order to maintain their traditional values in life. And this, to come back around, like, where's the hope, Michael? This is hope to me. This brings me hope of seeing organizations working at this level together to make positive change. So we also talked about pandemic era science, and this was a little bit of a grab bag. This was an interesting session to put together because I'll be honest, I wanted to sort of talk about lots of different things in this. But let's take a blast and go back into our time machine and look at the headlines from 2020. And of course, there's the headlines we would expect, right? It was a year of grim headlines regarding COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths. But then we also saw some interesting things, right, about how global carbon emissions were declining, or that animals are rewilding on YouTube at least. And we'll come back around to that headline in a little bit here. So there are a lot of things going on that related to the pandemic with the environment and with the human condition. And Robert Montgomery joined us to talk about some of his interests having to do with this idea of the COVID-19 quietus. And that while it was a weird world for humans, it was a weird world for the environment too. And future libraries are going to be filled with theses and dissertations from looking at various aspects of this modern day pandemic. But one thing that we certainly saw, if you were unfortunately on Facebook or some other internet news source that doesn't necessarily moderate its news, there was a lot of things about, the dolphins have returned to the canals of Venice, and there's a variety of weirdly fake news that provided us with hope, right? We were hoping that, like, okay, this is good. Nature's hitting its restart. Like, that was something that people were talking about. And there are some good stories to come out of this, and we'll talk about one or two of those. But it needs to be steeped into into reality. And so reality, one study that very recently came out had to do with the response of urban birds in Spain. And unlike sort of what some of these headlines said, the viral headlines you might have seen, at least in Spain, it suggests that the birds didn't sort of flock back into the cities to the tune of Beethoven's Pastoral, Symphony No. 6. But that doesn't mean that nothing good happened. In fact, there's great studies that came out of Poland about the decrease in roadkill of these cute little hedgehogs that you see down here. And they're suggesting that there are over 10,000 hedgehogs in Poland that are alive today that would not have been alive had it not been for this decrease in the number of roadkill deaths associated with the quietus of less cars on the road. Some great research that came out of the Bay Area about changes in the vocalizations of birds and what the repercussions of that might be. We still don't know, but birds started singing differently because the environment around them was different. It was quieter. There was less road noise. What the repercussions of that are still yet to be determined. I'm personally excited about this sort of stuff, but the answer is yet to be determined. And so we saw these potentially positive things, like our lovely, cute little hedgehogs, right? But there were some challenges associated with this quietus, and particularly challenges for local communities who depend upon conservation, tourism, ecotourism, to maintain the quality of life, their livelihood. And so we saw decreased tourism, and then this sort of cascades up to more, unfortunately, illegal animal harvesting and so on. But we want these stories of hope to emerge, right? Because it does make sense because we do see this. We see this in an abandoned parking lot. When abandoned and left to its own devices, life finds a way, right? As Jeff Goldblum says. And those cute little hedgehogs, right? They did better. And we want to take those into battle as we we battle the fatigue of jadedness, this environmentalism fatigue, but we can't do that at the expense of truth, right? Because if we want to make data-driven decisions, we have to seek the truth, not the truth we want to hear. And so this is what Dr. Chelsea Wood from University of Washington sort of talked to us about. So there's this whole bunch of literature, okay? You don't need to read the gory details of each one of these little cutouts here. I'll summarize it up for you. It's that real world conservation, like the protection of biodiversity, helps real life humans protect themselves against disease. This is something that is out there in the literature very broadly as it relates to parasites and various disease-causing organisms. And she wanted to test this prediction to see how, is this true? Is this something we should hang our hat on as we go forward with helping both optimize biodiversity and optimize human health within the world? And so she did this, what's called a meta-analysis. If you're not familiar with what a meta-analysis is, it's like a study of studies. She reviewed the literature and looked at all these studies. And they looked specifically at the 24 human diseases that cause the greatest health burden for folks. And I just want to explain this graph real quick, all right? So if things are down here, all right, it means that urbanization actually decreases health burden of these 24 human diseases. If things are fully up here, then it means those things actually increase the health burden. So kind of like up here, bad, down here, good. And you can already probably guess where this is going if urbanization is down here, but it also probably makes sense, right? And urban environments, not, exclusively, but generally, there's greater systems for getting human waste out of the systems and so forth. So what they found is that urban areas or countries in which urbanization was actually increasing were actually decreasing their urban health or their human health risk. These other ones that cross the zero, we kind of can't say a lot about that. That's what these little error bars, for those of you who aren't familiar with statistics, these little error bars that cross the zero, it means it's variable enough that maybe we shouldn't say anything too strongly about those, but we see some trends there. But let's move on to forestation. And this, of course, flies in the face of this initial prediction. As countries increase their amount of forestation, they're decreasing, or they're also increasing the human disease risk that they're encountering, or the human health burden that they're encountering. And now for the grand finale, drum roll, biodiversity crosses that zero. So we can't really say conclusively one way or another how biodiversity is necessarily helping us in terms of at least these 24 diseases that, according to the World Health Organization, are the diseases that are leading to the greatest human health burden. And so the point of all this is we can't spin fairy tales, right? That's not productive for us to spin fairy tales. Humans, zoonotic diseases, biodiversity, by their very nature, go hand in hand. And so, we can't count on these fairy tale solutions. And instead, we need to think about paths in which we can minimize risk moving into the future. And here's where enters Dr. Mrinalini Watsa. Now, she's up at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and together with colleagues, she published a paper last year that talked about that we can do better than we have in terms of wildlife disease surveillance, and made some suggestions. And one of those things we could stand to improve is that our pandemic response systems are slow and uneven. And as a case study in that, here's a paper. I'll read it to you if you're reading on your phone. It says, human-animal interactions and bat coronavirus spillover potential amongst rural residents in southern China. So this is in biosafety and health. And in their conclusions, right at the very end, it says, considering the proven potential of some SARS currently circulating in bats in southern China to infect humans, blah, 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 blah. This represents a clear and present danger to our biosafety and public health. And it's like, yeah, no duh, right? Like we just lived through a year of this, but then we have to look at when this article was actually written and received. And yeah, the horse was already out of the barn in November of 2019, but this study, happened well before that. And it's just sort of a demonstration that we had some knowledge that there was a growing issue within this region, but the system wasn't nimble enough to take advantage of that knowledge and prevent what we've lived with as a globe over the last year. Another issue they highlight is that our reference laboratories aren't concentrated in the areas with the high need. And so, yeah, we got a lot of reference libraries for screening target pathogens in Europe and North America, but it's in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia where emerging infectious diseases are most likely to emerge. They also looked at or talked about how there are existing systems in place that we just aren't taking advantage of their potential in terms of wildlife disease surveillance. And so we have systems like CITES that are international agreements that regulate wildlife trade, but we're not taking advantage of that in terms of wildlife disease surveillance. And this paper, and I think Emma's possibly dropping these into the chat as we go along, but this particular article has to do with the trade between the US and all these different countries that are here of wildlife and the potential wildlife pathogen load that comes with that trade. And so these that are purple that end up here in the United States from China, India, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, Germany, looks like maybe Great Britain here. Those are all areas that are trading wildlife with the United States and the potential pathogen loads that they bear. And so this is something we need to be taking into consideration. We have the systems in place that regulate this trade. Why not optimize them to also take into consideration wildlife disease surveillance as part of that? And finally, we don't have a clear blueprint to follow about how to fix all of this stuff. But that's what Mrinalini is proposing in this paper that she wrote with her colleagues. And one thing that they're talking about are these ideas of in situ labs or decentralized biosurveillance. And this goes back to Arturo's recommendations, and it goes back to Cabo Polmo. Let's put the decision making and the training and the resources in the hands of the people who are closest to the work. And so this is an idea of developing in situ labs in areas that are in the highest risk for emerging infectious diseases to come out of. And I encourage you to Google in situ labs and check out their website. It's a organization that's trying to put this into place on a global basis. And that sort of stuff, like that gives me hope, to be honest with you, that there are people like Mrinalini Watsa who are out there thinking of creative solutions to help us avoid the next COVID-19 or the next pandemic, the COVID-20, I guess, or whatever it's going to be. So the last session here was a biodiversity roadmap for California. So let's don our optimism hats and take a look at some of these headlines. And whoa, there's a doozy straight off the bat. The crossroads for humanity, Earth's biodiversity is still collapsing. And this is based off of a report that came out at the end of 2020 that basically said, you know, we've been trying and we haven't been successful in meeting our goals internationally on protecting biodiversity. And then you see in California an effort to try in a new and different way. And that's because in California we've got a lot of biodiversity, and even though we do a lot of things well in terms of biodiversity conservation, things are still having problems. And so Dr. Hollis Woodward from UC Riverside talked to us about bumblebees in general. This is just one bumblebee in particular that lives in our neck of the woods, and her research is indicating that, yeah, their range has really decreased quite a bit. And And so what she's doing now, not just with Bombus crotchi, but a couple of other species that have declining populations and numbers, is looking at their genetics. And this is part of a larger project called the California Conservation Genomics Consortium. There we go. It's led by a group out of UCLA, but it's made up of researchers throughout California, not just California, who are looking at lots of different taxa, not just bees. They're looking at lots of plants, they're looking at vertebrates, all sorts of things. And the goal is to build this most comprehensive database or data set of genomics for conservation science. And it's like, woo, yay for genetics. Like, how's that going to help conservation? And how genetics helps us is that it helps us avoid what folks call the extinction vortex. It sounds really out of this world. But the idea behind this is that it's a feedback loop in which small populations, because of various, parts of them being small, reproduce less well and then become smaller populations until they become extinct, right? But the question is, what is a small population? Who defines small? And that's where conservation genetics or conservation genomics can help us out. And Dr. Amy Vandergast from the USGS here in San Diego talked about how, San Diego Management and Monitoring Program, our own hometown heroes who are working on this work are using conservation genomics in action. And this is just one example that has to do with mountain lions, very charismatic. But what they do is they establish metrics, right? Because we're all about data-based, data-driven decision making. So let's establish some metrics that are based off of science. What that says is that, we want at least 30 mountain lions in San Diego County. They can look at the genetics of these things and say, like, okay, well, currently we've got at least 31.6. And you'll have to talk to Amy or somebody else about effective population size and how you can have 0.6 of a mountain lion. But it's because it's it's a math thing. But then we need to reassess that on a regular basis. And so they use this and they can say, hey, the condition's good. We're within this metric that we've determined through research will help us sustain a healthy population. We've got good confidence in that because we got a lot of data to back it up. But the trend is not existent because we haven't reassessed it into the future yet. And so that's what they're working on, is using this and other types of science to develop these metrics so that we can really monitor the progress and make adjustments to the management of biodiversity in our own backyard. So kudos to the management and monitoring program. And it works, okay? And this was an example Amy brought to our attention that has to do with the cute little Arctic fox here. And the work that has been done in Scandinavia about using this sort of conservation genomics to supplement populations with different gene pools, right? We're going to move these from here and these to there in order to increase their population size. And it's been so successful that they've started to expand their range. So it's worked out in the real world. This isn't just academic pie in the sky, kind of like it can work. It's proven itself out in the real world. But things are really disappearing pretty fast, right? And dare I say, faster than our capacity to understand their genetics and the best management practices and tools to implement to help save them. And so enter California Plant Rescue and Crystal Horn, who talked to us. Again, a super collaborative project you see from all these names over here. And what are they doing? Excuse me, they're collecting seeds. They're seed banking seeds. It's a pretty straightforward process in their own words, but they do it. They keep detailed records to make sure that they know where the plants come from, so they know which gene pools they came from and stuff like that. And they're saving them. They're saving them for the future so that when something needs to happen in the future, say something disappears and drops off the face of the earth, we don't have to wait for a non-drought year to sort of kickstart getting seeds to try to help these plants out. We've got a seed bank to work with. And what I was most impressed by with the California Plant Rescue Project is the progress that they were able to make in 2020. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, lockdowns and all this sort of stuff. And with a really a small amount of money in the big scheme of things from the state of California, they've been able to make tremendous steps towards getting all of what are called the 1B ranked taxa. And these are kind of like the rarest of the rare plants in California. And so far they have 747 different taxa, and 64% in 2020. They got a big chunk of them, and not only just a big chunk of them, but they also got them from throughout California, whereas their previous efforts were primarily concentrated in Southern California. So kudos to them for expanding not just the number of taxa, but the ecoregions that were covered. And where I want to end is by talking about a story of integration and conservation. And this was Amber Paris blessed us with her presence to talk about a group project coming out of the Climate Science Alliance called Resilient Restoration, Advancing Ecological, Cultural, and Community Resilience with the Tribal Nations of Southern California. And so they were part of this project. They're looking at plants of tribal concern from a perspective of historic use and historic importance to livelihoods and practice. And so we've got this graph here. There's a whole lot going on in it, or this figure here that's got a whole lot going on in it. But you know, but what we see straight off the bat, right, is that there's lots of connections, right? There's lots of connections between these things. But most importantly, at the center of this is this tribal working group. It's the people closest to the work, the people who are most likely to implement and practice the conservation measures that are to come out of this. And so while UC Riverside's involved as researchers looking at plant distribution modeling and how things will change with climate change, and while San Diego State University is looking at greenhouse experiments to try to identify drought tolerant oaks in this particular case that can be sort of in the spirit of the California Rescue Project, sort of there for the future in a world in which we are going to be confronted with more and more drought. While all this is happening, it's the Climate Science Alliance and their tribal working group that are leading this effort, right? Informing this effort. It's the people closest to the work that are under the position of leadership. It's those whose livelihoods and way of life that are most likely to be impacted by this. And that's where we need to start. That's where we need to hold our heart. In this case, it's with the tribal working group of the Climate Science Alliance. But remember Cabo Polmo. Where does it start? Remember the Desert Landscape or the Sky Island Alliance Conservation Cooperative. And where does that start? And remember the dreams of Mernala Niwatsa, and with this idea of decentralized biosurveillance within the communities that are most likely to be encountering these emergent infectious diseases. So I always have to include this picture. I love it. Thank you, Michael Field, for taking this picture of this cute little fox. I love the way he's just got one little hand held up right there. We're going to refer to this fox as Insanity Fox. Why are we going to refer to this fox as Insanity Fox? Mostly just because I wanted to use this picture, but I also wanted to talk about insanity. And I love this idea that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We have to think different to make a difference, right? That continuing to do the same thing over and over again is probably not going to change anything. And I think the State of Biodiversity and a lot of these talks showed us ways to think differently, specifically not thinking top down, but thinking bottom up. And so in that, you know, sort of idea, I want to go back to a slide that I showed last year in my wrap up of the third annual State of Biodiversity, in which I was talking about how the 2020 UN Biodiversity Conference, in which there is going to be a renewal of the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is this sort of international agreement, which the US isn't part of, thus why we're colored in purple on this graph here, was going to be held. Well, you know, clearly a little something got in the way of this being held in China, where the meeting was supposed to be held. So it was pushed off until 2021. But, I was, back in 2020, I can remember thinking, oh, if only the US would join the rest of the world in the Convention for Biological Diversity, that would move the needle a little bit more, but that didn't happen. So here we are in 2021, 2021, and now we've got a chance again to be part of this global conversation about change in the future. But the Convention for Biological Diversity has existed. And in fact, it was that report that I was showing you earlier about biodiversity collapse was talking about how the Convention for Biological Diversity didn't reach its own targets. And so this is sort of where the insanity enters into the picture. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We need to think about the conservation of biological diversity differently. And just sort of to think about this on a scale of impact approach. Here we've got the Convention for Biological Diversity. Biden just released information on the America the Beautiful 30 by 30 report out of the Department of the Interior. We saw a headline about California's 30 by 30 plan. At the very local level, Todd Gloria signed on to San Diego's mayoral Monarch pledge, a pledge to do some things that are going to be good for monarch butterflies here within the city of San Diego. And we can imagine a situation, right, where you might live in a homeowners association, or you might have a community leadership group where you decide that you want to go use native plants in your commons areas. Or you might be planting natives in your own yard or patio or box, right? We've got this different scale at which things can happen. And the probability of success is higher the more you have influence over it, right? And because let me get my pointer out here, for this to happen, a lot of this stuff has to happen, but for this to happen, you just need to go out in your yard this weekend. So the probability of success is higher. Doesn't mean these things aren't going to happen, but the probability of success of this is higher. But the flip side of this, right, is the probability of transformative change goes from low down to high here. And so we need to be tackling this from both angles, but it's critical over and over again, right, that we involve the people who are closest to the conservation impact in the decision-making process of things that are going to affect their livelihood in the long run. And fortunately, the Convention for Biological Diversity recognizes that, and they have their zero draft of what the convention is going to look like for this meeting that's coming up later in 2021. And they specifically address this, but it needs to be coming from both sides. And what we saw in the State of Biodiversity this year were stories of inspiration that showed us models of how this can happen at a larger scale. So this is really just a fancy way of saying, think globally, act locally, but it's more than that, because you can do more than this. You can impact all of these other things. And I've got homework for you, but hopefully you won't think of it as homework, because there is a way you can impact this right here. You just have to do it by March 14th, which is 2 days away now. But if you go to the californianature.ca.gov website, scroll down below Get Involved, there's a public input questionnaire that you can go to. And if you've got great ideas, you want your voice heard about the California by 30 by 30 plan, here's your opportunity. Get involved. I did this yesterday as part of a workshop. It doesn't take too long. It takes as long as you want it to, because you're typing in the answers and you can go into as little or as much detail as you want to. But I highly encourage you to do it. It's on a regional basis, and your feedback will inform what happens within our backyard here in the San Diego region. So with that, I want to thank you all. I want to remind you that the International Day for Biological Diversity is coming up here on the 22nd. And finally, I want to thank the State of Biodiversity speakers. It was their time and talent that made this symposium possible. And I mostly just want to apologize in advance that if I misrepresented anyone's research, that's on me, that's not on them. And so I hope I did a good job. I try to do a good job in researching all of this and making sure that I'm staying true to your hard work, and I hope I was successful in that. And my finally is that I really want to thank the staff at the San Diego Natural History Museum that makes this happen, everywhere from fundraising to operations to research to education and outreach, and specifically Emma Bloom, who is such a great host for our Nat Talks and was critical to the process of bringing the State of Biodiversity to San Diego this year. So thank you very much.